Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Indigenous Perspectives, Lost Language, Lost Culture, Goatsi Hinamet. I'm going to use as much native Laguna language as I can, that's almost it right there. Since we're talking about language and language loss, I'm a prime example of how that happened or can happen to a person. So I want to again welcome you. Save Our Schools Arizona Network is the sponsor of this series, Indigenous Perspectives. And I would like to welcome our panelists, Dr. Jenny DeGroat and Dr. Sheila Nicholas. And I will be reading their bios. And so you can get to know a little bit about them, and then I'll be doing an introduction and opening for this session. And then we will go into our questions for our panelists. So again, thank you for being here. So Dr. Jenny DeGroat is a member of the Navajo Nation, or Dene. She is an instructor within the Bilingual and Multicultural Education Department at Northern Arizona University. She is also an Indigenous language immersion consultant who assists Indigenous communities with language revitalization efforts across Native country. She has assisted with planning and implementing a Makav language model in their new tribally owned school with the Pipe Aha Makav people in Needles, California, which opened fall 2019. Now, if I mispronounced anything, they'll let me know. Dr. Sheila Nicholas Hopisino is from, I can't say the Songopavi village, Second Mesa, Arizona. She is a professor in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Sociocultural Studies at the University of Arizona and faculty instructor for the American Indian Language Development Institute. Her scholarship focuses on Indigenous and Hopi language maintenance and reclamation, Indigenous language ideologies and epistemologies, the intersection of language, culture, and identity, and Indigenous language teacher education. Dr. Nicholas is currently co-principal investor of a multi-university national study, Indigenous Language Immersion and Native American Student Achievement, funded by the Spencer Foundation. She is an instructor consultant for the Indigenous Language Institute of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Okay, so Dawa'e for being here today. Thank you for being here. And if you'd like to say a little bit about yourselves before I move into the introduction, that would be great. Dr. Nicholas.
Nukwan tafkiuma Sheila Nicholas yan pahan ma tiu kyang nupio hopisino ni kapan wat umumi nama tak nani ovi ne ko tahon mana yan hopi ma tiwa ne songo pangak sino ne kalwangwa ne muyi yuta pam kalwangwa but ne ahila nata pam because wangwa ni kyang ne Laura Nicholas because wangwa nit pu Milton Nicholas is wangwa amumi wangwa asquali yakpi amumum hisavo. So I introduced myself in Hopi. My Hopi name is Kotsahon Mana, which can be translated into White Bear Girl. I'm from the Sun Forehead clan from the village of Songopavi. My parents are Muyi and Ahila, mother being Sun Forehead, my father the Bearstrap clan. But I was raised from birth by my mother Laura, who is the Eagle clan. And her husband, which is my father, also Milton Nicholas, Coyote clan.
Great, thank you so much for being here again. And Dr. DeGroat?
Yeah, she Jenny DeGroat in Shia, Ashin, the Shlakia, Ani Basushin, Kudichi name, Tashachero, Senajini, Dashanada. Take out Kele, Yasina Shadow, Kade, Kode, Without Oscar Kinshanda, Nanshkin. I the nest and do yat do yat did her I'm Jenny DeGroat and I'm originally from New Mexico, area called Mariano Lake. I've been teaching here at NAU for 19 years. And yeah, so thank you and hope to share as much knowledge as we can on these two topics of language loss, revising revitalization, reclaiming. There's different ways that people are working in this area. So
great. It's really good to have you both here. And I neglected to say that I am Laguna Pueblo and from the village of Ensenal, and I am a member of the Sun Clan on my mother's side. My father was not Native American. All right, so I have a fairly lengthy introduction just to give you some history behind this, behind Indigenous or Native American languages. So from the time of Columbus arriving here in 1492 and the progression of Europeans across the continent, tribal peoples, along with their languages and cultures, were eliminated. Some of this was due to exposure to diseases to which they had no resistance. Some was due to wars between Indigenous people in the United States, and some was due to government policies, programs, and laws. One government program of assimilation included Native American boarding schools or Indian residential schools. These schools were major contributors to the loss of native languages across the US in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indian children were forcibly abducted by government agents, sent to schools hundreds of miles away, and beaten, starved, or otherwise abused when they spoke their native languages. Due to the suppression of Indigenous languages, the Native American Languages Act was passed in 1990. The act states that the United States, quote, declares to preserve, protect, and promote the rights and freedom of Native Americans to use, practice, and develop Native American languages, unquote. In addition to fully recognize the right of Indian tribes and other Native American governing bodies, states, territories, and possessions in the United States to take action on and give official status to their Native American languages for the purpose of conducting their own business. The Esther Martinez Languages Program Reauthorization Act was passed in 2006 and amended in 2019. This act allows for Native language immersion programs, Native American language teacher training programs, the development of Native American language materials, such as books, audio and visual books, tools, and interactive media to teach Native American languages and more. So there's just a little bit of history right there. So my first question is, so with all of that, why are we still losing Indigenous languages in this country and at a rapid pace? So Dr. de Groot, would you like to respond to that question first?
Okay, so it's a tough question and has to do with a lot of internal and external factors, mainly due to the boarding school. They did a lot of, I guess, disrupting our language and our ability to keep our language going. And I think one of the main reasons that we face language loss is that we don't see a purpose for our languages as we did in the past, because our languages are mainly for survival. Today, most people use English for that purpose. And so a lot of disruption included not communicating with the elders, because in boarding school, you were kept away. Like for the Native people, you stayed away during the winter months. And during those months, a lot of oral history and all the origin stories, ceremonies were done. And we were not, we didn't participate in those events. And then when we came back during the summer, those times are not meant for stories. They're mostly for just other summer activities. So a lot of knowledge in those areas were not provided. And as time went, more English became the language for most families. And today we're faced with a lot of the Native people's children who are growing up not speaking or learning the language in the home. And so there's so many other factors: Christianity, assimilation, colonization, you name it. It affected majority of Indigenous people today. And from the boarding school era, if you look at the history, and we tend to say, well, I didn't go to boarding school and I wasn't affected. And so I would always ask individuals, do you speak your language? And they would say no. And my response is, you were affected. Otherwise, we would be speaking, everyone would be speaking their language today. And so there's this whole study right now known as epigenetic, which is severely affecting all our ways of solving our issues and being motivated to speak our language. We are, for the most part, our mindset is mostly English based. And so to think in our language, you have to raise your conscience. You have to tell yourself, say it in Dene or say it in Hopi or Apache. And so even fluent speakers face this challenge to remind themselves or to make sure they're staying in the language as much as possible. And so, yeah, so it's both internal and external factors that impacts this whole being able to use language today.
Okay, yeah, as usual, I think most things that involve Native Americans is complicated because of our history and all the impact over the centuries that the non-Native people have had on us and our communities. So Dr. Nicholas, would you like to address that question?
Yeah, I appreciate and Asqueli, Jenny, for setting that tone from that perspective so I can build on that a little bit. And yeah, I think we've moved the idea of survival from subsistence and self-reliancy on, for the Hopi, it's like raising corn, to one of Western economic survival, which created a dependency on the outside world. So now we focus on jobs and the economics, and those are usually lacking. So a lot of that as well. But I also, for the first time, heard the notion of a lack of ideological clarification by Tlingit scholar Nora Dowenhauer. And what she meant by that was that out of our desperation and urgency sometimes to address language loss and language shift, is that oftentimes we need to work on vision and action, but if we have a vision without action, it doesn't move anywhere. It just passes the time. Or if we have action without vision, we don't have a direction. Mm-hmm. So what I've seen in my experience is oftentimes the two haven't come together to have vision drive the action in a particular direction. So there has to be, or there has been a lack of conversation at a community level in many communities about the role of language today and the fact of how does it still an important part of who we are as Native people. The other one is that in their sense of urgency, they've really delegated a lot of this work to schools. And with this responsibility and how it's interpreted by parents and community sort of builds on the residential school era and history, is that they no longer have a say. They expect the school to take care of this issue, reverse it, or somehow address it. And unfortunately, the schools are still prioritizing Western curriculum. So, the responsibility and accountability to our children is also not clearly addressed in terms of language. So we have a lot of schools, I think, that offer language in the schools, but again, it's continuing colonization because if you were going to hire a Spanish teacher in a school, you would expect that person to be a Spanish speaker, even if that person wasn't, natural first language speaker of Spanish, or even a Hispanic person. That person would have gone and learned the language, been trained in how to teach it, but that's not afforded to our community speakers, both first language speakers of our languages as well as those who are learning. And then once they get into schools, there's no curriculum. there's no resources except their own cultural knowledge. So a lot of our language teachers' expertise and specialty, I mean, this is a specialty. You're not going to find the Hopi language anywhere else but in that community. So it's a unique expertise that is not recognized or misrecognized. And then in the school system, it's marginalized. So they are, typically they are, from my experience, they are teacher assistants. They play that role in the schools. And so they already don't have space, they don't have time, and their first priority is often to the classroom teacher. And you know, their responsibility is a myriad of responsibilities, not just teaching the language. So, you know, those are more recent reasons why we're still losing the languages in this country at a rapid pace. And just thinking about Nunavut, you know, circumstances or that landscape there, they really described it well, that if you do not provide that kind of resource for language teaching in the schools, it's ongoing colonization. We don't have the resources there. We don't have the capacity there. It's not being built. So it's going to continue to be challenged in being revitalized if you're just looking at the schools only.
So do you believe it's too late to retain native languages that we still have today?
That, to me, that's, I talk about something like that from two perspectives. If you believe that, then you're working from a pedagogy of hopelessness. Mm-hmm. But this belongs in you. And what I've learned through the Hopi language is it's within you to do something about it. Because if the school's not going to do it, are you just going to stand back and wait for a time when somebody does think about doing it for you? And there's a lot of time lost. So I, you know, tend to work, and Jenny and I both work from a pedagogy of hope. And I think the Wampanoag peoples are an exemplary example of, you know, not believing and not working from a pedagogy of hopelessness, because their language was asleep for over 150 years. And now it's being spoken as a first language. So you have to look at those kinds of examples to say, if they can do it, we can also do it. But it really is almost a personal choice, an individual action. And if you model that, you tend to pick people up along the way. So you're like a tumbleweed, right? You're moving and you're picking up people. But part of that involves looking at yourself. And I have to thank one of my first instructors, a Japanese instructor, Akira Yamamoto, for making me recognize that when I asked him what happened to my language, he said it didn't go anywhere. It's just inside you. You just have to bring it back up. And that means you have to look at yourself and then look within, because as the Hawaiians say, it's still there. It's part of our legacy. And Jenny talked about epigenetics. If the trauma is there, so is the language. So, you know, it's really at an individual level where you have to make some decisions and take action. So I have a vision, and I'm moving very slowly at an individual pace, but I've picked up a few, you know, and a lot of them will drop off. Some will return, but I'll feel fulfilled.
I'm sure you have me beat. I'm moving at a real slow pace here.
But you're moving.
But and it gives me hope, because I started, when you were talking about that, it's in you, it's there. I started thinking about, well, I was exposed to all of this. I heard my mother speaking it. I heard her sister speaking it, my grandmother. So it's in there, and I have concerns about being able to make the sounds, the phonemes, and because my tongue doesn't move that way. But you know, I can try. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to make this all about me. So let's move to the next question. So you are both making huge efforts. You've given your professional careers in life to this, toward language preservation and revitalization. So I'd like to know what fuels you, what makes you do this work, Dr. DeGroat?
It's about decolonizing your mind. It's about standing up and being resilient, standing up to all the policies that put us in this path. And I do my best to advocate for Indigenous people to look at their own ways of knowing. And in this work, it's all about decolonizing your mind and even your your psychological mindset. When I work with the net teachers or any Indigenous people, I do my best to inform what has happened, what has brought us to this state of endangerment of our languages. And it is very emotional. The process is very emotional, a lot of denial, a lot of guilt for those fluent speakers who didn't give the language to their children. So it's my mission or my work to help understand that this is for us to resolve. No one else can do it for us. Our languages are endangered. We're the speakers. We know the linguistic sound system. And so a lot of our ways to solve our own issues, that has been taken through time. So like Sheila said, we feel helpless. We feel overwhelmed and even trying to learn our own languages. And yet we have learned to speak English, and we have learned to give English to our children, grandchildren. And why not our language? So these are questions for everyone to ask themselves. What can I do? I've worked with languages that have no speakers left, and they've been able to bring through immersion methodologies, encouraging to learn the language, even if it's documented or recorded. Hear those phrases, the words, come up with ways to understand what they mean. Sing songs, because singing is much easier than saying a whole words without any connection to what they mean. So a lot of it is comprehending those sound systems. And linguists say that words are just sounds until you put meaning to them. Then once your brain understands, it tells your mouth, speak it, you know what it means. And so we're so hung up on saying it right. And so we get discouraged because of that push to make sure that students say it right. And it's not going to happen. A baby doesn't say words right from the beginning. A baby goes through steps of language acquisition. They need a lot of support, a lot of feedback. It's okay to make mistakes, to say it, for them. And if they're trying, just, give them encouragement. And so we can get out of this thinking that we have to say it right and we have to know it overnight. No, you have to know a lot about language acquisition to support one another in this process. So yeah.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I know when we were younger, there's 6 of us in my family, 6 kids. I was number 5. Number 4, my brother Keith, he and I wanted to learn when we were younger. I don't remember how old we were, maybe 9 and 13 or something like that. And that's exactly what happened. We didn't pronounce things right, and we got laughed at and teased a little bit about that. And so we were very discouraged, and we just said, oh, forget it then, if you're just going to make fun of us. Mm-hmm. And so we let it go. So, and I've heard that a lot from different people as I've worked. I was the director of Indian education for the state of Arizona. And before that, I worked in Title I for 9 years. I was there almost 18 years, and I worked with a lot of school districts on reservations or nearby reservations. And when we talked about, learning the language, that was one of the things people shared is, I can't say it right, and they make fun of me, or they will make fun of me, so they wouldn't even start. So that's important for people to realize that, well, on both sides, don't pick on somebody, encourage them. And on the other side, don't get discouraged. You're not going to get it right the first time. So thank you. So I'm going to switch a little bit. I mean, it's the same topic, but I was reading an article about Alaska languages being lost and how that impacts the culture. And then that led me to some other things, such as the environment. So one of the hot button topics of the election is climate change. And over the last 4 years, there's been question about, is climate change real? Is it, do we listen to the scientists, or is this just something, our weather's just changing because that's what happens every few thousand years. So can you discuss a little bit how environmental knowledge is connected to language? Because that's what this article was about that I read. Is that any kind of thing that you guys investigate as you're working in your programs, Dr. Nicholas?
Yeah, actually, it's been a really central topic in the last courses I've been teaching over the last couple of years. Oh. But the primary thing is that this situation we're in of climate change, according to the Hopi people and to their epistemology, is not unprecedented. Mm-hmm. It's happened 3 times before in 3 previous worlds. And it's a sign of the word in Hopi called Koyaniskatsi, which means life out of balance. It means that we've been disconnected from our stewardship responsibility of the first and original instructions we had when we came into existence as a people in our places and our land and that world that we're in. So it's not unprecedented, and the signs of all of the devastation, natural disasters, and then the human, all of this stuff is just signs that we are out of balance. And there's a prophecy that says when it gets there, we'll be seeking a better life. See, every time that this happened before, it was at the hands of the people who disregarded their instructions, and then there were a few who were seeking a better life. It's kind of interesting how that kind of connects to immigration, because that migration is just part of our history, mm-hmm. seeking life, a better life. And it's, it's very different in terms of a good life, which is happiness, good health, bounty, family, happiness, free from sickness, So we're moving towards that. And, there's been talk among the elders who say that it's not unexpected. And how are we going to move forward into the 5th world? Who's going to go? So, it's really all tied to this. And some of the reports from 2 summers ago about the fires in Australia, some of the literature that came out was that the Aborigines knew how to do control fires. Mm-hmm. But once their land was taken and they were displaced from those places, they couldn't do that practice. And that's the same thing for all of the fires where everything is going. We're no longer, we're abusing the earth. And so what happens with the earth is Mother Earth will go into the process of healing herself. And it means that it's got to be destroyed before it's rejuvenated, given rebirth, and everything is renewed. It's a cycle of renewal. So I mean, that's my understanding of Hopi epistemologies, ways of knowing and being and doing. And so I incorporate that into all of my teaching in my courses now. And people will call it land-based pedagogy, place-based pedagogy. but it all is moving towards the same thing, is that we have to look back at our instructions and remember ourselves to them.
Well, that makes sense to me. Dr. de Groot, do you want to talk about maybe from a Navajo perspective?
Yes, so we have this concept to reach as we grow through life, and that state is known as hojo, meaning the state of balance. And it requires a lot of practice to get to that state and to remain in that state. And it has to do with language because it involves prayer, and we understand balance using the 4 elements. And so we pray to these elements, which is the power, the source of the natural laws that are given to us and we're to live by. And unfortunately, because of language shift, those words and prayers and songs are disappearing. And we have language to talk to, let's say, the tornadoes, if it was coming, to floods, to water, we speak to them. There's words and prayers to talk to them. We have offerings to make so that they don't harm the 5-fingered people. Yes, they can renew themselves and help to renew Mother Earth and so forth, but not to hurt the 5-fingered people and the animals. And so that's why language is important. That's what language was given to us for, is to communicate with all the other living beings and how they live, to help us to understand and to keep us connected so that that balance would be there. So right now, because we don't speak to these elements, we're faced with a lot of hardship and destruction with the environment. And in many indigenous languages, they'll tell you stories of how certain words were given to them, certain practice was given to them, so that they can continue on to live well with every living thing in that environment. So land is what gives you the words, and it gives you the concept of how to live with that environment. So if I'm Jeanette, and as you all know, we have a large land base, but not every community is the same because they're different. They're like, depending on the land, you'll know the language of the plants, the animals, and the way the land forms, the sacred land or mountains that we have. Some don't have mountains, so they have mesas, and some have different plants, so they have different names for those plants. So it gives us the language to live within that land. So that's our understanding of how the 4 elements are the powers. They're the ones that, not money, not politics. It's the 4 elements, the way we understand as the Nath people, that gives us that life and balance and so forth.
Yeah, I know for sure when I'm out of balance. And when I was working for the department before, I know I was putting a lot of time into my job and into as much as I could into my family, my husband, our children, which are feline children currently, and not the thing that was throwing me out of balance was not time for myself, time to exercise, making sure I ate well, those kinds of things. And since I've been working for myself now, I have much more balance. I feel much better. My head, I suffer from migraines, but my headaches are fewer and farther between. And I speak to our animals, our children. Unfortunately, I don't know Laguna, but I did take French and I lived in France. So I speak French and English to my cats. And I think they understand. Anyway, So in 2019, that was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And I looked on their website, and it states that Indigenous peoples are often isolated, both politically and socially, by geographical location of their communities, their separate histories, cultures, languages, and traditions. And yet they are not only leaders in protecting the environment, but their languages represent complex systems of knowledge and communication and should be recognized as a strategic national resource for development, peace building, and reconciliation. Given all of this, what is your perspective on why these attributes are not valued by our leaders in government and our schools? Because we talked about that before. It's Western culture, it's Western thought, Western methods of educating our children. So that would, we could presume that they are not valued by our leaders or our governments and schools, or they would have been incorporated already. And I do know that some of the ways that people are talking about educating students currently are a lot like what Indigenous people have done over the years. It's more hands-on, it's more showing by example, like our elders would show us how to do things, and then we would do them, as opposed to being, having to read about it out of a textbook or something like that. So can you give me your thoughts on that? Or maybe you disagree, maybe they are, these ways are valued by our government and our leaders. I have a feeling you don't, though. So, so who wants to go first on that question?
I can just go. Well, I think you laid it out very well, is that they are, the land and all of the and place are very much resources, and they're valued. But the perspective and interpretation of value is different. So, land, place, anything natural is objectified, and it's looked at as not living, and it can be something that can be extracted, cut down, all of those kinds of things. Whereas in the Indigenous perspective, those are all peoples. It was the plants and animals who were peopling the Mother Earth first. And in different tribal communities, their creation and origin stories identify, a woman, like in one as a sky woman, or, coming and that's how we know now land as being either, Turtle Island or Mother Earth. But even in the Hopi epistemology, we came into the fourth world with the assistance of plants and animals. So, and they were people, they communicated with each other. So the differing ways of looking at what was here to sustain humankind is very different. And one is driven by the resource of money, something capitalistic neoliberalism.
I'm glad I'm not the only one stumbling.
That's English. It's a word that my tongue doesn't want to say. So, I mean, I think those are totally different ideologies and perspectives of what's here in our natural world, and how we're supposed to, and how we're supposed to use it or not. That's why this idea of manifest destiny, of taking our land, and that's really the major reason why the stories are still going, that Indigenous people, a few of them, the land that they have are very diversified and can tell us a lot of things. Yet then you've got corporations and businesses that are taking it away and destroying it to do things. The most recent story is, the Brazilian people are being forced off their land for cattle ranches so that the United States can bring in hamburger. That was the most recent story I heard. And if we don't know the source of that hamburger in the grocery store, we don't think about it. But see, those are kept from us, so we don't understand that we are complicit in this destruction of what sustains humankind.
But would you say we have some responsibility once we're adults and, you know, to also investigate those types of things? Especially like right now when we have an election going on. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of people, they mark their ballot because, oh, I recognize that name. Mm-hmm. They've heard it, they've seen it on a bill, you know, on an advertisement or something, mm-hmm. but they don't know really what that person stands for. And
I think we're in denial. It's because it's too convenient for mm-hmm. us to deny it and then kind of look the other way. But once you have a critical consciousness of it, it's really hard. So there are people who don't go to certain stores because they know where the products come from. Mm-hmm. They don't buy certain things because they know where the products come from. But there's so few of us who educate ourselves, and I'm one of the ones that I don't have all of that knowledge. I try to be, you know, the fact that I would like to grow my own garden so that I can eat better food. Mm-hmm. I'm still not there, you know. So there's a lot of conveniences that like I said, it's a crisis of dependency. I recently read that notion, and I said that's it exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not by any means saying that I'm one of those people who investigates everything. In fact,
yeah, and that's we have to be if we want to make a change.
Yeah, my sister's very good about all that, but she's also retired and has the time. That's my excuse. Yeah. Dr. DeGroat, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I just want to mention how we had, the year of Indigenous language, like you mentioned, mm-hmm. but it left out the communities. We as intellectual or working with the academic arenas, we get that information. We're informed about these movements or laws and so forth, but it does not reach the communities. And so they're not able to celebrate. And then the leaders of a people are also not informed of the seriousness of the state of our endangerment in all languages. They're not able to then push to help move some of these, like English only. We tried to put it back on the ballot so that we could at least maybe vote against it or have the people change that law. Mm-hmm. But we didn't get that on the ballot. And we tried, I tried to work with my Navajo Nation to write a letter to the state, to the legislators to, why this needs to be put on the ballot. Mm-hmm. But it didn't happen. So those, they tried to write letters, but as far as really having all the 22 tribal members to actually come forward to do this, that might have helped, I don't know, but with little voice, not enough voice, we don't have a strong voice, and most of the times we don't have money to support these policies or laws to help push it through whatever courts or whatever to make these initiatives happen. So a lot of times our communities, the people that need to hear this, are left out. And that's one of the reasons why I always wish that we could hold workshops for tribal leaders, mm-hmm. so that they can really help inform the communities, their people, make policies, make the language, the official language in their communities, their nations. It takes, I don't know, sometimes you just feel like, I don't know, it's just been so much to think about where we're at. After so many years, Sheila and I have worked at this, we still do not see speakers coming out of these efforts who who we can actually say they learn the language and they're using it on a daily basis to communicate.
Yeah, that's why I had that question for you. What keeps you going? Because I know languages are being lost, and it has to be somewhat discouraging when you don't see those numbers increasing. And
but yeah, it can happen. Look at Sheila. She's relearning her language. She's claiming it, and I'm so proud of her, and always use her as an example. Plus, the Amaka people that I work with down in Needles, California, we started with 6 speakers, and now they have 2 left. And in the 3 years, the language teams that I work with, they were non-speakers of their language, Macabre. And so as adult learners, I had to help them to become adult learners of their language, and plus learn to teach it using immersion strategies. And when the school opened, they included a space for the language where the children can be given the language. And so we changed the process, though. We didn't call it teach your language. It was about learn your language. So the concept of learning their language and giving language back is what was very helpful to get the communities and the children to begin to learn their language, give language back. And today you can hear children saying a lot of words and phrases in Macau. And it all had to do with the tribal leader, the tribal chairman, who had a vision to bring language back. And so to put it in this new school that they built, and he made it happen. And so he's the only tribal leader I know who pays his language team to learn the language full time. It's work that they have been identified to do, but they get paid for it. So that's
that Western concept coming into play. But it's necessary because that's where we live, in the dominant societies based on economics. And
if I can speak to that a little bit.
Sure.
Again, it's interpretation. You know, when we think about, because that is a what's the word I want? It's a tension around this idea in language revitalization that people want to get paid to do this and to learn their language, but that we're using a Western concept to be divisive. It's reciprocal. I mean, you know, you if you wanted to, in the days when currency wasn't the reciprocal kind of payback, I guess, maybe it was food, you know, maybe it was produce, but there was always a reciprocal exchange, and it was 2 ways. So, you know, how we interpret today the fact that someone who spends all their time and is working on behalf of the community gets reciprocated, and by whom, you know, we can take that to the negative, or we can move it towards the positive. You know, this is not easy work, and there are so few who are willing to commit themselves to it. And I always like to use the idea of the when an airplane drops pressure and, you know, the oxygen masks come down. Yes. They always tell you to put the mask on yourself before you can help others. So the amount of work it takes to, like my instructor said, was to pull out the language that's within you. You know, when you're constantly, like you said, humiliated, teased, laughed at, those are traumatic interpretations of, I think, this shock at saying, what happened to our language? I like to talk about it that way because if we don't understand that history as not being something we did to ourselves, but as something that happened to us And as my mentor, Emery Sikyakwapiwa said, that it's the circumstances of the time. So we have to understand what caused that, and then how we heal ourselves in order to move forward, especially in the fact that on the one hand, looking back, you want to honor your ancestors for the sacrifices they made so we could still be here with what we have. They left us those footprints. And then to look forward and say, you know, where we want our children to enjoy that, to imagine that world where life is good, not because of how much you accumulate, but because of your health, your family, happiness. That's the balance. And we, Jenny and I and you, are the ones who are the conveyors. We're facilitating that movement. So the question I ask myself now, and others have raised it, is what kind of ancestor do I want to be? You know,
Yeah,
I want to be one that honors my parents, my forefathers. I had a clan father, Louis Tawanima, who became famous for his running, but he was a prisoner of war taken to Carlisle, Pennsylvania for 5 years because he protested the way Western education was imposed on our people. He didn't oppose education. Mm-hmm. He opposed the way it was being done.
Method, yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that he came home a celebrity is, to me, very much an example of how strong his culture and language and his identity was.
For sure.
And he's a model that we have to look at.
Yeah, I really love that. You ask yourself what kind of ancestor you want to be. Now, I've been thinking about that too, because if I manage to learn the Laguna language, who am I going to pass that on to? I don't have any children. I wasn't able to have any children. And my sister's kids don't live here. But you know, if it does nothing else, it makes me better connected to my.
Here's the response to that.
Okay, let's hear it.
I believe what Ophelia Zepeda says, that we throw words into the air. And from my own research, I heard parents say of their children, wherever they hear the language, it goes in somewhere. If you believe your body is a porous, it's porous, it takes in things. And if you believe language is energy and it's alive, and you throw those words, the language surrounds you. It's embedded in place. So, you know, the whole idea is that the language isn't really gone. It's gone silent because we're not speaking it. So you need to bring out whatever you know, one word. I don't have anyone to speak to here, but I talk to myself. I translate comics every day. I make myself think in the language. I call up colleagues back home when I need some help to remember some words. So it's that idea of it's within you and it's your choice. If you're going to envision a future for the language and you want to contribute to it, you have to do it from your sense of self and responsibility. Even if it's one word, throw it into the air.
Okay, dawa. Thank you. Gosh, this time has gone by so fast. We have 5 minutes. I guess we don't have any questions from the chat box, but I know people are watching and listening in. Let's see, I have a lot of other questions I wanted to ask, but let me see what we can maybe end up on. So, all right, so we've talked about government, our schools, immersion programs or the lack thereof, opportunities for people to learn from native speakers aren't necessarily there in the schools. We've got paraprofessionals as opposed to educators whose main job is to teach a language is also lacking. What can just your average educator do to ensure that Native languages are valued and respected by their colleagues and the students themselves? So, I mean, you're not even talking about teaching them at this point, just making them valued and respected, that it's a good thing to do, that it's a valuable thing for students to do. And you know what, yeah, go ahead.
I just would like to say that if we're going to value Indigenous languages, it has to be included in the school. Not that they're going to teach the language in the school, but to include Indigenous education for these children who attend these schools. Most Indigenous students do not get their history. They do not get any recognition of the people, their heroes, our own leaders. They don't even know maybe what's in their nation seals or the flags that are flowing and in their government buildings or by their government buildings. And even how many Indigenous people are around them, there is no such way that any student could value themselves because they spend most of their days in schools. And if they don't see themselves, if they're absent in these schools, how can we expect the students to value themselves or to value Indigenous people or their own tribe or their own nations? That ties into identity, because to have that identity will help you to realize, oh, I have my own language. I would like to learn the language, because in language revitalization, one of the first thing you have to work at is that connection to your identity. You gotta motivate learners to know why do you want them to learn the language? And if that identity is not in place, you need to work at that before they get motivated to understand, oh, okay, this is why I need to learn my language. So as long as schools don't include Indigenous people or Indigenous history, representation of who our children are, I just see no place where this identity can happen, because it sure isn't really happening in the homes either. Unfortunately, we don't share our stories, our history with our children. They learn what they can from what the curriculum wants them to learn.
And from the media, whatever they see on television,
Media.
whatever's around them, yeah.
So we're absent in a lot of places.
I agree. And, you know, I am the founder and CEO of the Southwestern Institute for the Education of Native Americans. And this is included in some of our trainings that we do, because you're right, it's missing. And that's something I worked on with the Indian Education Advisory Council, that the Department of Education, to try to write curriculum materials, develop those so that the history of each of the 22 tribes in Arizona could be taught. Because our educators don't know it. They didn't get it either when they were in school. So they don't know how to incorporate our history or culture or sense of identity into their teaching. And so we want to provide professional development to them so that they can do that. They can do that with confidence. So thank you so much again. Like I said, the hour just zipped by. It's another big topic. We find that like the importance of voting session. We had 2 of those because the first one didn't cover it. And now we're going to do a session after the election. So to just kind of unpack what happened, see if we can get data on Native Americans and how many more hopefully voted in this election than the last one, et cetera. Perhaps you might want to come back another time and we can continue this discussion on language and lost culture, and get to some of the questions that we weren't able to cover. Also give our audience a chance to think of some questions that they might have or some input that they want to give. So I'd like to just extend an open invitation to you both now and for a possible session in the future if you've got the time. And we can discuss that offline, but again, I really appreciate the time that you've given today. And I know our audience learned a lot. So until the next time, thank you so much for joining us for Indigenous Perspectives.
Well,
Con ạ.
Bye-bye.
bye.
Oh.